As a result of its numerous military successes, the population of the Ottoman Empire had grown to around 30 million by the 17th century. Its territory extended from parts of modern Libya to the Arabian Peninsula, the Balkans, and modern Hungary. Its sultans simultaneously commanded both the holy cities of Jerusalem and Mecca. Sustaining such an impressive empire required a great amount of resources, planning, and administration. Moreover, the constant urge to expand its territory only added to the strains on the Ottoman Empire's resources. The empire's key economic question was therefore how it could support these massive military demands. How did the Ottoman Empire support its expansion? Sustaining consistent military successes over hundreds of years could not simply be attributed to great individual leaders, as these come and go. To understand how the Ottoman Empire became a military juggernaut, we must examine its political and economic structures. How was the Ottoman policy set up? Military and tax policy was run by the Sultan and his Grand Vizier from the capital. Their subordinates were generally Christian-born Balkan slaves, selected as children to work as bureaucrats. However, the state was not only governed by the Sultan's household. As a primarily Muslim empire, whose founding purpose was holy war, the support and inclusion of Muslim religious leaders was key for Ottoman sultans. Therefore, Muslim leaders had the power to decide some laws, and ran much of the judicial system. Despite these privileges for Muslim leaders, religious minorities were protected by the state. This was necessary to keep peace in such a large and diverse empire. The Jewish and Christian populations had zimmi status, meaning they paid extra taxes, but received religious freedoms in return and could have their own judicial institutions. The Timar system. In the provinces, the elites were generally Timarots. These Timarots were central to the function of the main fiscal system in the classical Ottoman Empire, the Timar system. In the absolutist Ottoman state, the Sultan technically owned all the land. However, under the Timar system, soldiers were granted control over sections of arable land and the peasants living there. Timarots had the right to keep part of the taxes these peasants paid. In return, Timarots had to provide the Sultan with troops maintained at their own expense, whenever called upon. Consequently, in 1640, it was estimated that the Sultan could raise an army of 200,000 cavalrymen without any cost to his own treasury. In short, the Timar system was the Ottoman Empire's response to the questions of both how to collect taxes and how to pay its army. However, the Timar system was not only a fiscal system, it was key to maintaining social stability in the empire. Under this system, peasants had a relatively large amount of freedom. Other than collecting dues, Timarots had few lordship rights over peasants. For instance, unlike lords in much of Europe, Timarots did not run the local judiciary. This lay with religious institutions. In fact, in 1551, Hungarian magnates petitioned King Ferdinand to emancipate the Hungarian peasants, because many Hungarian and Croatian peasants were fleeing to Ottoman territories for better conditions. Additionally, the Timar system aided the assimilation of diverse populations as the empire expanded. Conquered elites were often made Timarots, making revolts less likely, as elites were given a vested interest in maintaining Ottoman power. For instance, the Balkan aristocracy and Greek Orthodox bishops were given Timars after conquests in Southeast Europe. The Ottoman state benefited from the authority and relationships these elites had built up with their local populations, indirectly gaining the loyalty of normal rural people. Therefore, through its fiscal system, the Ottoman Empire was able to both support the cost of conquests, but also to stabilise its control once territories were conquered. However, we should not view the Ottoman economy as only serving the goal of military expansion. The relationship between the economy and conquest went in two directions, not one. Conquest was key for economic growth in the Ottoman Empire. As the Ottoman territory expanded, the areas it could tax, and therefore overall tax revenue, also increased. Between the mid-15th and 16th centuries, the empire expanded massively into the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. These expansions inevitably increased revenues paid to the centre. However, this growth only came from increasing the number of subjects paying the annual tithe and other taxes via conquest. The growth in revenue did not, crucially, come from developing the economy to increase per capita productivity. This placed a limit on the economic growth of the empire, a limit it would soon hit. Once the empire reached the limits of its expansion, revenues would stagnate. As we have already mentioned, in its classical period, the Ottoman Empire grew its economy and tax revenues by military expansion. As the empire conquered more territories, it increased the population paying taxes. However, the model of growth became problematic once the Ottomans started to face repeated military defeats from the 17th century. The population of the empire declined as territory was lost, going from over 30 million in the 17th and 18th centuries to 22 million in 1914. Fewer taxpayers meant less in tax revenues. As growth by expansion was beginning to fail, the Ottoman Empire needed other strategies to grow its economy. From the 17th century, Europe was innovating and industrializing, applying new scientific discoveries and technology to increase the output of each individual worker. This allowed countries such as the United Kingdom to grow their economies without having to grow their populations or territories. However, the Ottoman Empire struggled to do the same. In Europe, much of the investment for industrialization came from a growing middle class who invested their money in new technologies that improved efficiency, and who could afford to employ the large number of workers needed for a factory line. The problem for the Ottomans was that they never had a middle class large or wealthy enough to invest in such techniques and push forward industrialization. The Ottoman Empire had always been very diverse. To maintain stability with such a diverse population, the sultans saw maintaining social harmony as a key part of their job. Consequently, many state officials believed that the middle and elite classes should never be allowed to become wealthy enough to exploit the lower classes. As the Ottoman Empire was an absolute monarchy, all property in the empire was ultimately thought to belong to the sultan. Therefore, under the Ottoman legal system, it was very easy for the state to confiscate property from individuals it worried were becoming too personally wealthy. Government elites often received massive salaries whilst they were in office, but when they retired, this income was either taken away or significantly reduced. Wealthy merchants were frequently targeted by the government in what were effectively property confiscations. They were forced to become çeleps or çelepkasan, and had to purchase sheep from the Balkans at market prices to sell in Istanbul at very cheap rates set by the government. Usually, these cheap rates did not cover the cost of the initial purchase of the sheep, let alone the cost of transporting them from the Balkans to Anatolia. Therefore, çeleps were often financially ruined by this duty. Official policy also limited the profits of artisans to 2 to 10%, through the imposition of maximum prices, which were monitored and enforced by the guilds all artisans were part of. Profits for merchants and artisans were therefore generally low. However, borrowing in the Ottoman Empire was very expensive, with average interest rates of 15 to 20%. Therefore, the middle classes were both unable to earn enough money to invest in industrialization, and also unable to borrow enough money for these investments. Consequently, at its collapse, the Ottoman Empire was primarily still an agricultural economy, in which the most important unit of production was an individual family with 2 oxen. European governments had been able to support the massive burdens of the military revolution through borrowing. Financial institutions such as banks had been developing in Europe since around the 12th century. When governments needed to raise armies or invest heavily in their militaries, they were able to borrow up to double their gross national product from these institutions at very low rates of interest. However, in the Ottoman Empire, politically powerful Muslim religious elites had discouraged borrowing, as it was seen as contrary to the law of God, the Sharia. Though this technically did not prevent religious minorities such as Christians and Jews becoming moneylenders, political barriers preventing the middle classes from building significant wealth meant the empire did not form a significant financial class whose sultans could borrow from. Therefore, not only was the Ottoman timar system unable to raise enough revenue to properly fund the military revolution, the alternative route of borrowing was also closed to the Ottomans. Another problem with the timar system was that the revenues raised from it fluctuated. As these revenues were based on a tithe on agricultural production, proceeds varied depending on how good the harvest was. Officials during the military revolution decided that under these pressures, it was better to be able to precisely predict the state's income. Therefore, the Ottomans developed the malikane. This was a tax farming system, a type of tax system in which the state sells the right to collect taxes from a certain area to the highest bidder. This bidder then has the right to keep all the revenues raised from this area for themselves. If they raise more taxes than they paid in their bid, they make a profit. But if tax revenues are low, they must still pay the state what they promised in the bid, regardless of if they profit or not. Essentially, tax farming guaranteed the Ottoman state a predictable income. Under the malikane specifically, bidders bought lifetime tax farms, making a large initial payment which was followed by set annual payments. Therefore, if an area covered by a malikane became more profitable over time, the tax farmer increased their profits, whilst the state got the same amount. Though this system allowed officials to predict what revenues a state would receive, it was very inefficient. Under a quarter of the taxes collected reached the central government, the rest remained with those who owned the tax farms. Therefore, though the government had a predictable income, they still struggled to raise enough money to fund their growing military costs. Consequently, the Ottomans developed massive foreign debts and had to give over many sectors of their economy to foreign companies to get investment. By the 19th century, the empire's transportation and public utilities were mostly owned by foreign companies. When the empire finally established the Ottoman Bank in 1856, the initial investment mostly came from Britain. In name, the empire finally had a domestic bank to lend to the state. However, in reality, the dominance of British capital meant it was still effectively borrowing from abroad. These debts were a key reason the empire entered into World War I. By 1914, the empire's foreign debt was equivalent to 60% of its gross domestic product, and just paying off interest on these loans absorbed a massive amount of state finances. Officials saw the war as an opportunity to gain control over these debts. Allying with some of these debtors could give the empire the opportunity to demand that some of these debts be written off. Weakening Britain and France might provide an opportunity to wrestle the Imperial Ottoman Bank out of their control. Therefore, in the end, their debts were a massive reason the Ottoman Empire was pushed towards supporting Germany in World War I. Ultimately, this put them on the losing side. The empire's defeat in 1918 led to its formal collapse in 1922. Turkey was left impoverished, and much of its previous territories were divided amongst France and Britain. The collapse was caused by a military defeat, but arguably, the origins of that defeat lay in economic problems the empire had been battling for hundreds of years.